There is something especially unnerving about a place that was built to be busy. An empty field does not bother people in the same way. A mountain without houses on it feels natural. A desert without traffic feels correct. But a town with sidewalks and no footsteps, a hotel with curtains and no guests, a train station with marble floors and no trains, that feels wrong. It feels like the place itself is holding its breath. That is because towns, factories, ships, and highways are all built around a single assumption: people will keep coming back. The lights are installed because someone is expected to flip them on tomorrow. The roads are paved because someone is expected to drive them again next week. The school is built because next year's children are already imagined. A place becomes unsettling when all of that preparation remains, but the people do not. Today, we are looking at 10 abandoned places in America that should not exist anymore. Not because they are spooky, not because they are photogenic, not because ghost towns are inherently mysterious, but because every one of these places reveals a pattern that still exists in the American system right now. A town built on one industry, a community built in the wrong geography, a transport network replaced by a faster one, a company town left behind the moment the money stopped, a place poisoned so badly that leaving became more rational than staying. And that is why abandoned places matter. They are not really about the past. They are about what happens when a system loses the one thing that made it make sense. Let's begin. Number 1. Centralia, Pennsylvania. There is a town in Pennsylvania that has been on fire since 1962. Not visibly in the way a house fire is visible. Not with flames leaping above rooftops. The fire is below ground, burning through coal seams and abandoned mine tunnels beneath what used to be a borough of more than 1,000 people. According to Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, Centralia had a population of about 1,100 in 1962 and just 5 property owners by 2013. The Commonwealth says fire control and relocation costs reached $48.8 million. The fire has been expected to keep burning for centuries. This is where Centralia stops being a quirky disaster story and becomes something darker, because the timeline matters. The fire started in May 1962. That means there are people alive right now who have never lived in a world where Centralia was not burning. Most disasters end. Floodwater recedes, hurricanes pass, earthquakes stop shaking. Centralia became a place where the disaster itself settled in permanently. And permanence changes the psychology of a town. A short-term emergency creates solidarity. People clean up. They help one another. They tell themselves that normal life will resume. A permanent emergency does the opposite. It drains confidence 1 year at a time. It turns every repair into a question. Why replace the porch if the ground under the porch may not be safe in 5 years? Why open a business if customers are slowly being bought out? Why plan for a future if the state is quietly planning for your disappearance? The famous images of Centralia, steam venting through cracks in the road, winter snow melting in strange patches, warning signs about unstable ground and carbon monoxide, are dramatic, but the real story is arithmetic. In 1983, Congress approved more than $42 million in relocation funding. More than 1,000 people ultimately moved out. More than 500 buildings were demolished. Pennsylvania eventually used eminent domain to condemn the borough's properties. Centralia was not abandoned because its residents suddenly stopped loving it. It was abandoned because the numbers stopped permitting stubbornness. There is a reason Centralia remains one of America's most unforgettable abandoned places. It violates a basic expectation people have about land. We assume the ground is the stable part. A house can burn. A business can fail. But the earth itself is supposed to remain reliable. Centralia is what happens when even the ground defects. Number 2, Bodie, California. If Centralia is a town destroyed by what was under it, Bodie is a town created by what was under it. Gold transformed Bodie from an isolated mining camp into one of the roughest boomtowns in the American West. California State Parks says Bodie's population swelled to more than 8,000 in the 1880s. Contemporary accounts and later summaries put the total somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 people, with roughly 2,000 structures at its height. Today, only about 110 buildings remain standing, preserved in what the state calls arrested decay. That phrase, arrested decay, is one of the best descriptions ever invented for a ghost town because it tells you exactly why Bodie feels different from a ruin. It has not been reconstructed into a theme park, and it has not been left to vanish completely. It has been held in suspension. Not alive, not gone, just paused. But what makes Bodie really useful for understanding American abandonment is how quickly the life cycle of a boomtown exposes itself once the boom ends. During expansion, a mining town can look like a permanent success. It gets newspapers, hotels, saloons, churches, schools, warehouses, family homes, stores. It acquires layers of ordinary life. That is how false permanence works. Once enough daily routines accumulate, a place starts to feel inevitable. Then the ore body changes, or the market changes, or the costs rise, and all at once you realize the whole thing was standing on one leg. Bodie's decline began in the 1880s. Fires in 1892 and 1932 reduced what was left. Mining officially ceased in 1942. The town's story is often told as folklore. Outlaw town, gunfights, the famous line, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." But its deeper lesson is much more modern. Bodie was a single-sector economy with no second act. Once the extraction curve bent downward, everything else was just a delay. And that is why it still feels contemporary. America still builds places around temporary abundance and then speaks about them as if they are future-proof. Bodie is what happens when the difference between profitable and sustainable is ignored for just long enough to build a town. Number 3. The Packard Automotive Plant, Detroit, Michigan. Few abandoned places in America better capture the scale of industrial rise and collapse than the Packard Automotive Plant. At its peak, the Packard complex covered about 3.5 million square feet on 40 acres and employed around 40,000 people. It opened in 1903 and became a landmark of modern industrial design, including early large-scale use of reinforced concrete in auto manufacturing. Packard automobiles were built there until 1956. 40,000 workers is the kind of number that forces you to stop treating a factory as just a building. A factory of that size is not a workplace. It is a gravity source. It organizes bus routes, diners, corner stores, lunch counters, machine shops, repair services, nearby housing, neighborhood rhythms, and eventually the emotional self-image of the city around it. And Detroit, for a long time, was a city built around that kind of gravity. But gravity becomes dangerous when it depends on one model of industrial strength continuing forever. Detroit's population peaked in 1950 and then began one of the most dramatic urban declines in the United States. Census-based summaries show the city falling from 1.85 million people in 1950 to 639,111 in 2020, a drop of about 65%. The Packard plant was not the only reason Detroit shrank, obviously. Suburbanization, racial segregation, freeway construction, deindustrialization, automation, competition, policy failure. The city's story is too large for one building. But the plant became an almost unfairly perfect symbol because it was so physically enormous. It made collapse visible at the scale collapse actually happened. A modestly abandoned storefront can still be explained away as bad management or a weak location. A 3.5 million square foot plant cannot. A structure that large becomes a confession. It says, "This country once believed this many jobs would keep existing in this exact form, in this exact place, for a very long time." That confidence turned out to be wrong. And then there is the design irony. The Packard plant was once considered one of the most advanced manufacturing spaces in the world. Modern, rational, efficient. That matters because people often assume abandonment happens to obsolete places. But often the opposite is true. A place is abandoned precisely because it was built so specifically, so perfectly, for one economic era that it becomes difficult to adapt once the era ends. Number 4. Cahaba, Alabama. Some abandoned places die because the money runs out. Cahaba died because geography eventually overruled ambition. Cahaba, also spelled Cahaba, was Alabama's first capital, serving from 1820 to 1825. It sat at the confluence of the Cahaba and Alabama rivers, a location that initially looked strategic for transport and political importance. But the same river system that made it useful also made it vulnerable. Frequent flooding undermined its viability, and the state government moved the capital to Tuscaloosa in 1826. There is something almost cruelly American about the confidence embedded in early capital cities. A government chooses a site not just because it works in the present, but because it is trying to announce a future. Roads will come here. Trade will consolidate here. Influence will live here. A capital city is a geographic prediction. Cahaba turned out to be a bad one. The town did not vanish immediately after losing capital status. In fact, it revived in the cotton boom of the 1840s and 1850s, then later served other roles after the Civil War. But the long-term story had already been written. The floods kept coming. The vulnerability was structural. No amount of optimism changes what a river decides to do over decades. That is why Cahaba deserves a place on this list. It reminds you that not every abandonment is a story of financial mismanagement or industrial collapse. Sometimes the problem is simpler and older than economics. Sometimes the place itself was always less stable than its founders wanted to believe. Modern America likes to imagine that engineering, logistics, and investment can out-negotiate geography. Often they can for a while. But eventually, a floodplain still acts like a floodplain. Cahaba is what a failed argument with a river looks like. Number 5. Kennecott, Alaska. Kennecott is one of the clearest examples in the country of what a place looks like when an entire town is built to serve ore. The National Park Service describes Kennecott as the best remaining example of early 20th century copper mining. Mining operations ran from 1901 to 1938. By the time the operation closed, the mines had produced 591,535 short tons of copper from more than 4.5 million tons of ore, valued at $200 million in 1938 money. At its peak, the operation employed roughly 500 to 600 men on 3 8-hour shifts. $200 million in 1938 is not a successful mine. It is the kind of output that bends an entire remote landscape around itself. Rail connections, mill buildings, worker housing, management housing, warehouses, power systems, supply chains. Kennecott was not a town with a mine nearby. It was a machine for converting mountain geology into money. And that distinction matters because it explains the abruptness of what happened next. When a diversified city loses one employer, it hurts. When a company town loses the reason the company came in the first place, the town stops making sense almost overnight. They are built for efficiency rather than resilience. But those are different qualities. Kennecott was efficient enough to become historic. It was not resilient enough to become ordinary. Today, the red mill buildings look dramatic against the Wrangell St. Elias landscape, almost theatrical. But the visual beauty should not distract from the underlying lesson. When a place is built entirely for throughput, the place itself is disposable the moment throughput ends. Number 6. Bombay Beach and the Salton Sea communities, California. Some abandoned places are destroyed by a moment. Others are worn down by a trend. The communities around California's Salton Sea belong to the second category. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Salton Sea was marketed as a recreational destination. Boating, fishing, waterside property, resort town optimism in the desert. Then the biology and chemistry of the lake began to turn against the fantasy. The sea has no natural outlet, so salts and pollutants accumulated. As the water body shrank, exposed lakebed expanded, and dust problems intensified. California's own Salton Sea materials note the continuing challenge of rising salinity and exposed playa. A California Air Resources Board presentation in late 2024 warned that the rapidly declining sea is leading to increasing dust concentrations throughout the region. This is why Bombay Beach, Salton City, and other nearby communities feel so eerie. They were not built around one mine or one factory. They were built around an environmental assumption that the sea would remain a viable asset. Once that assumption failed, the local economy did not collapse all at once. It softened, rotted, and emptied in stages. That kind of abandonment can be even more unsettling than a clean break. Businesses close one by one. Property values wither instead of crashing in a single dramatic event. The beach remains, technically. The roads remain. The houses remain. But the meaning drains out of them. And this is where the Salton Sea communities feel very contemporary. America increasingly has places where environmental change does not produce one cinematic disaster, but a steady erosion of habitability. More dust, less water, worse air, fewer tourists, slower investment, a little more leaving every year. Bombay Beach still has residents. That is important. This is not an extinct place. But it is a place where abandonment behaves like weathering. You can watch the social contract dissolve molecule by molecule. Number 7. Gary, Indiana. Gary is not a ghost town. That is precisely why it belongs on this list. Its population peaked at 178,320 in 1960. By 2020, the census counted 69,093 residents. More recent estimates put it a little lower still. That is a decline of more than 60% from its peak. Gary remains home to U.S. Steel's Gary Works, the largest steel mill complex in North America, but decades of industrial restructuring and job loss profoundly altered the city. The reason Gary matters is that it shows the spectrum between city and abandoned place is much wider than people like to imagine. America has many places that are not formally dead, not entirely empty, not photographically ghostly, but functionally hollowed out. Blocks with too many vacancies, schools closed because the children are gone, commercial strips built for volumes of spending that no longer exist, neighborhoods carrying the infrastructure footprint of a much larger population. That is a different form of abandonment. Population abandonment without total civic erasure. Gary was built in 1906 by U.S. Steel as a company town. That origin story matters. A city built around one industrial logic does not easily find a replacement identity once that logic weakens. And when employment leaves, population follows, but streets, utilities, tax burdens, and physical maintenance obligations do not shrink in neat proportion. The city is left trying to govern yesterday's footprint with today's tax base. That is why partially abandoned cities are so difficult to revive. The problem is not only jobs, it is geometry. Too much city, too few people, too much deferred maintenance, too many structures with no next use. Gary's power as a symbol comes from the fact that it is not over. It is still living with the consequences. Number 8. Picher, Oklahoma. If Centralia is the American story of a town abandoned because the ground was burning, Picher is the story of a town abandoned because the ground was poisoned. Picher sat in Oklahoma's lead and zinc country, part of the wider tri-state mining district. According to Oklahoma's Department of Environmental Quality, the Tar Creek area includes more than 500 million tons of mining and milling waste across the broader district, around 300 miles of underground mine tunnels in Oklahoma alone, more than 1,320 abandoned mine shafts, and severe contamination involving lead, cadmium, zinc, acid mine water, and subsidence. EPA describes Tar Creek as one of the nation's largest Superfund sites. Picher became nationally infamous because children there were found with dangerous blood lead levels. Massive chat piles, mining waste mounds, surrounded the town. Subsidence made the land unstable. A tornado in 2008 accelerated what contamination had already made clear. This town had lost the argument for continued habitation. The federal government began buyouts. Residents left. Picher was eventually disincorporated. What makes Picher especially disturbing is that it forces a more uncomfortable question than the classic ghost town narrative. A mining town that empties when prices fall still fits the mythology of boom and bust. A town that empties because the wealth extracted from beneath it left behind a toxic landscape asks a harder question. What exactly was the real profit if the place itself became unlivable? Picher is a brutal example of delayed accounting. The money came first. The bill arrived later in blood tests, contaminated yards, unstable ground, and a community that had to be erased because the legacy cost of extraction turned out to be larger than the town could survive. Number 9. The SS United States. The SS United States is not a town. It is not even fixed to land. And it still belongs on this list because it may be the purest American example of an abandoned machine that lost its era. The SS United States entered service in 1952 and became the fastest ocean liner ever to cross the Atlantic, winning the Blue Riband with a speed record that still stands. She carried nearly 2,000 passengers and more than 1,000 crew. She retired from active service in 1969. The SS United States Conservancy says the age of the great ocean liners was effectively ended by increasingly fast and affordable transatlantic airline travel. This is why the ship matters. It was not defeated by failure in the ordinary sense. It was defeated by replacement. It was a masterpiece of one transportation regime rendered uneconomic by a better one. And replacement is one of the most important drivers of abandonment in modern America. Not every abandoned place is bad. Sometimes it is simply too slow, too expensive, too specialized, too fixed in the assumptions of one moment. The SS United States was built for a world in which crossing the Atlantic on a liner still carried commercial and cultural weight. Once jets changed the time equation, the elegance of the ship stopped mattering enough. That is such a modern kind of death. Not dramatic destruction, not even disgrace. Just obsolescence at scale. The reason the ship remains emotionally powerful is that its design still projects importance. It still looks like something that should matter. But that is exactly how abandonment works when technology outpaces prestige. The thing can remain magnificent long after its usefulness has been repossessed by a newer system. Number 10. Glenrio and the Route 66 Ghost Corridor. Route 66 was one of the original highways in the U.S. numbered highway system. Established in 1926, it ran 2,448 miles from Chicago to Santa Monica. For decades, it supported a chain of service economies: gas stations, cafes, motor courts, repair shops, souvenir stands, diners, and small towns whose survival depended on traffic stopping rather than merely passing through. And then the interstates arrived. There may be no cleaner example of infrastructural abandonment in America than Glenrio, the Route 66 community on the Texas-New Mexico line. The National Park Service says Glenrio's boom times ended in 1975 when Interstate 40 bypassed the town. Today, the Glenrio Historic District includes the old Route 66 roadbed and 17 abandoned buildings. Bypassed is such a deceptively gentle word for what happened to towns like this. It sounds almost polite. In practice, it means the movement that once justified your existence has been redirected a few hundred yards away at higher speed with no reason to stop. Your diners do not get fewer customers because the food got worse. They get fewer customers because the cars no longer need your exit. Your motel does not lose out because the bed's changed. It loses out because the trip has been redesigned to skip your town entirely. And that is why abandoned Route 66 towns feel like economic fossils. They preserve the shape of an older version of mobility. A version where distance was consumed differently, where the road itself forced pauses, where local businesses could survive on being useful to a flow of travelers who had not yet been optimized past them. The interstate system made travel faster, safer, and more efficient in all kinds of ways. That is true, but efficiency has casualties, and one of them was the landscape of small service towns that existed because inefficiency once gave them a reason to exist. Glenrio is not just a ghost town. It is a receipt for a national upgrade. Final thoughts. Here is what these 10 places have in common. None of them was abandoned for no reason. That sounds obvious, but it matters because abandoned places are often romanticized as mysteries. They are not mysteries. They are consequences. Centralia was a consequence of an underground fire that outlasted civic patience. Bodie was a consequence of a resource economy with no durable base beyond extraction. The Packard Plant was a consequence of industrial restructuring too large for one city block, or one city, to absorb cleanly. Cahaba was a consequence of geography refusing to cooperate with political hope. Kennecott was a consequence of building a town around ore rather than around life after ore. The Salton Sea communities were a consequence of environmental decline, arriving more slowly than local optimism. Gary was a consequence of what happens when an industrial city loses too much population but keeps too much physical footprint. Picher was a consequence of extracting value first and pricing contamination later. The SS United States was a consequence of one transportation age being overthrown by another. Glenrio was a consequence of speed rerouting itself around places that depended on slowness. Every abandoned place in America is really a story about dependence. Dependence on one mineral, one company, one route, one technology, one environmental assumption, one political decision, one economic era. And that is why abandoned places are never just visually interesting. They are diagnostic. They tell you where a system was too narrow to survive change. That is the part worth paying attention to in 2026, because America still builds this way. It still builds distribution hubs around logistic assumptions that may not hold forever. It still builds exurban growth around cheap driving and cheap insurance that may not remain cheap. It still builds local economies around tourism, around one employer, around one water reality, around one version of mobility, around one commodity cycle. Abandonment is not a 19th century problem. It is what happens whenever complexity is financed on the assumption that one underlying variable will remain friendly. And sometimes it does, until it doesn't. That is what makes these places feel haunting, even if you do not believe in anything supernatural. They remind you that permanence is often just confidence with enough concrete poured around it. A town is declared, a plant is opened, a capital is named, a ship is launched, a highway is signed, and for a while all of it feels inevitable. Then the ore body declines, or the route shifts, or the labor model changes, or the water turns bad, or the contamination bill comes due, or a jet crosses the Atlantic in hours instead of days, or the river floods one time too many, or the fire under the town keeps burning long enough that the country realizes no one is really coming back. That is what these places are, not interruptions, outcomes. And if they are unsettling, that is because on some level they are supposed to be. They are the physical remains of confidence that turned out to be too confident. That is the real hook here. America is full of abandoned places that should not exist anymore, because America is full of systems that once looked permanent right up until the moment they weren't. And when people visit these places now, what they are really looking at is not emptiness. They are looking at the leftover shape of certainty,